today essentially introduces the Mastercopy method. In drawing, we kind of have to really talk a little bit about the origins of art school as a means to talk about the premise and the practice of working from the masters. And if we think about this, this goes back a long time, hundreds and hundreds of years. The conventional idea of art school actually didn't come about until the 19th century, and it happened in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. So art school as an actual trade was practiced within these workshops that were run and housed by working professional artists. And the working professional artists would take in students at a very, very young age. And so the students would help them produce the work. So that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a very young student making a drawing on a tablet. We're seeing an apprentice grinding paints. We're seeing one drawing from a cast. We're seeing one bringing in a panel from the doorway. We're seeing an older student working actually on a painting of a portrait commission. And then we see the master sort of finishing up one of the larger masterpieces, right? Which is where we get the idea of the master. Which is why we call it a master's in fine art. And that is the terminal degree for artists. And so the notion that art school is teaching something that is tradition and ages old is actually kind of incorrect, at least in the structure of the hierarchy of how that worked. So in the Renaissance, Giorgio Vasari, who was widely known for writing the biographies of many of the great artists during the Renaissance, he opened up the first academy in Florence. It didn't exactly exist as an art academy, though. It was more about sort of talking shop and talking philosophy. So the notion that you'd be sitting down learning drawing didn't actually happen. It was a sort of meeting of the minds. 10 years later, another academy opened up, focused on art theory. And then pretty much 10 years later down the lane from there, Annibale Carracci opens up yet another one, which is very close to what we see from a traditional artist workshop. So not quite an art school, much more about producing work collectively. And then in 1648, the Académie des Beaux-Arts in France opened. So that is the closest thing to art school as we know it and has defined how we actually train still. So I misspoke. I said the 19th century actually meant, the 1600s, mid-1600s. And it's still in operation today. It's still training and teaching students today. So it was essentially based off of, you know how plumbers have their training? First you're an apprentice, then you're a journeyman, then you're a master plumber. It was exactly the same system. So you were no different than a bricklayer, a craftsman, a woodworker, a printmaker who made books. You were literally no different. You worked in that system, and what you would have worked in would have been called an atelier. So an atelier is just a French word, another fancy French word for workshop or studio. Okay, and we still use this word today. So in the 19th century, what we've got here is an illustration of what would have gone on at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris, with the model, positioning himself, holding the rope, somebody, adjusting the lights, with mirrors and actual, because no electricity, mirrors would have been used with a skylight, essentially to direct the light onto the model to control it. And you see an entire room exclusively of men, right, learning this trade, and of gentlemen, essentially. And what you would have done your very first year is you would have copied lithographs or prints. And in America, when Charles Bargue collaborated with Jean-Léon Gérôme, who was a French academic painter, they made an entire series of lithographs that Americans would copy, and it became sort of the standard. It's still copied and used today. You would have spent the entire first year working in the flat. And that means you would have worked directly from these prints exclusively, only on drawing and then copying these drawings. So you would have learned a lot of things from these. You would have learned how to cite and measure. You would have learned how to make a beautiful sensitive line. You would have learned how to make a gradient or a tone transition. You would have understood planes. Okay? So you would have learned essentially how to practice and work from life, but from these flat prints. So it's much in the same way that a lot of us grew up as kids drawing from photographs, right? Or cartoons. In the second year, you would have employed the sight size method, which is essentially a sort of measuring technique that involves positioning yourself in the same position again and again. And you would have drawn from casts. And these would have been casts, and still are, they still do this, that were taken directly from the masterworks. So Michelangelo, the Greek sculptures and statuary from the Hellenistic era. So these would have been absolute facsimiles that you would have drawn from. In the third year, you would have drawn from the model. And so these are some academic drawings done in the 19th century and the 18th century. So Jean-Baptiste Pierre and then Paul Prud'hon, which is on the right there. We have a Prud'hon book in the library, which is amazing. They're all full of these academic nudes. It's a very expensive book. It's no longer in print. But you see, look, really lovely things that they're doing with hatch mark and with tonal concentration in the heightened technique. And then this is still done. So these are contemporary drawings sort of done in the same method and in the same teaching ideology as hundreds of years ago. Traditionally, you would have also done what's called an écorché, especially if you were going to be a sculpture student. And an écorché is essentially a practice in working from an armature underneath, so it's just a metal or wire structure, a stick figure, if you will. Then you would have built the bones on top of that with clay. And then you would have built the musculature on top of that with clay. And then you would have put the skin on top of that with clay. And you would have done that over the course of basically a year, maybe longer. It is an intensive practice where you learn anatomy from the inside out, gross anatomy. Yes?
How often is that still done? Because I've seen some people do stuff like that, but not over the course of a year, though.
It is absolutely still done. There are intensive courses. If you were to go to and there's a huge resurgence of ateliers in this country still, where you go and work with, a master from their studio for 2 or 3 years, and you'd be doing this. A lot of the really traditional figurative programs still do this. It could be over the semester. It takes a while, obviously. Oopsie. My Zoom call is happening right now. I'm sharing an account. So it's a long practice. It takes a lot of time. But the quick way to do it, which sort of touches on your question, is to do it in the drawing form. So you can take a master drawing and essentially work an écorché over it through the act of tracing, building the skeletal anatomy and then the musculature on top of that. Then you can learn quite a lot from that practice. So here we have some cast paintings, and basically the closest thing to a cast painting is what we call grisaille. And grisaille is another fancy French word meaning gray. And so this would have been every single painting before about 1830, 1840 would have been done in this method, where the painting is executed exclusively in gray and then glazed over with color. So when you go to a museum, oftentimes they all kind of look the same in surface, especially if they're old. That's why, because everybody used this technique. So that's why you would work exclusively in black and white for the 3 years that you would have been in an academic program. You would not have learned color until you left the program, which is a real surprise to most people, but you really do understand tonality and light, which is the core of painting. And drawing would have supplemented painting. It no longer does, and you've heard my argument that plenty of people live off of their work just exclusively doing drawing, but that is why. And this is more grisaille. So in academic programs now, people are really kind of peed off that they don't get to learn color. And so sometimes in the third year, they get to work from the still life in full color in painting using the sight size method, which trains you how to see, measure, and accurately plot your landmarks. Still to this day, you can go into museums and do direct master copies, looking at the piece right in front of you. oftentimes when you go abroad, you will see students set up with their easels, working all day long from these amazing paintings. And obviously you have to be very, very careful.
Do most art museums let you do that? Or is it...
Not all of them, but most of them do, yes, especially in Europe. In America, we've had, throughout the world, internationally, there's been attacks on artworks when people, crazed people come in and throw acid on a painting, or they'll slice it, right? So you get special permission, and you're, of course, vetted by your institution. This is a good student. You might have to have, credentials. I'm an academic. So just so that you're not some nut job walking in from the street, standing in front of a multi-million-dollar work that's set to destroy it, who's going to fling paint all over it. So more academic drawings, and then an academic painting, a Proudhon drawing, and then what that might look like. So we have a hall of casts here. So those would be the casts that you'd pull into the classroom or work from directly sitting in the hall. And then, of course, the model with everybody working. And these are generally smaller setups because it does require the sight size method where you have to walk back 10 feet in order to measure and then walk back to your drawing or painting. So women also would have been trained, especially in the 19th century. It was customary for gentlewomen who were, of good breeding, which is the old-fashioned word of saying, wealthy, landed gentry. They would have practiced drawing in watercolor all throughout their entire lives, and that would have been considered to be good, a good education for a young woman. If she was very interested in art, she would take classes only amongst women. A little bit of the academic process in painting. What those sort of successively look like. So doing academic copies of masterworks provides you insight directly into the thought process of the artist. It gives you an understanding of how they plotted out a composition, what they were thinking about in terms of light, how they turned to form, and why they made the decisions that they did. Doing a masterwork literally puts you in the position of the originator, which allows you many more skill sets than if you were to avoid it at all costs. So what we don't have often is the work in front of us. It is typically very difficult to get to every single museum that you want to in order to be able to learn from these actual objects. Because these actual objects look very, very different in person than they do in the flat. So what you're seeing here is a detail of the little lion head that's been carved onto the chair. And you notice how abstractly and flatly that lion head is treated, right? That's not something that you would glean from an internet image on Google. Typically, you would have made your career after you would have gone to the atelier or the academy, getting supported by your primary master, your artist. And they would have sort of introduced you to the gentle world of fine art, and you would have applied to the Salon. And the Salon was the place for you to hook up your next year's commissions. If you got into the Salon, that would ensure that you would have the connections needed in order to supply yourself with an income. And these works, basically this competition, all of the works would have been hung from the ceiling to the floor. And eye level was obviously the primary, real estate that people would have fought over. And this is where we get the term hanging art salon style. So not a lot of us do this anymore, but it is typically how you would have gone and seen the work. And you would have spent with your family Sundays roaming the galleries, looking at art. It was a part of everyday culture, no matter what class. It would have been written about in the newspapers. Here's an illustration that we would see in a newspaper talking about what types of people show up, whose mistress is with who's climbing and trying to find a man, which man is losing his entire income. We would have done this and read all about it in essentially the gossip columns of the newspaper.
I'm so sorry for being late.
I'm recording. So ultimately, doing this and focusing on masterworks would have provided a structure for you to base your compositions after. So we're looking at Nicolas Poussin here, and we're seeing the chaotic approach to the mess of flailing bodies here with the massacre of the innocents. Actually, I think that's the rape of the Sabine women, versus Paul Rubens' the rape of the daughters of Leucippus, where we have these, it's a biblical story of these two sisters being taken away to be wedded. And it, understanding that Poussin is working in the 19th century and Rubens is working during the Baroque era, 100, 200 years before, seeing those flailing body types and the chaos that's actually ensued will give you insight into the connection that artist clearly had, that Poussin clearly had, looking at Peter Paul Rubens. The neoclassical structure of Jacques-Louis David, who was a 19th century academic, French academic, in the Oath of the Horatii, is meant to be about order, democracy. They're pledging allegiance to essentially Rome here, right? Hence the salute. That's a salute. That's an old Roman salute. No, the Nazis did not invent that. And then we have these figures of women who are, embroiled in this passionate plea to, stay at home. And so their bodies are completely chaotic, thrown about, making S-curves, versus the very structured forms that the men make, which is meant to be about order and the military, right? The same sorts of ideas in the Death of Socrates. We have an academic, French academic here, famous for his portraits, Jacques-Dominique Ang, or Ang, depending on your French accent, and then a detail. How are you going to learn how to paint amazing satin without seeing this stuff in person? More Ang, which is very much about the beauty of women, typically, to somebody who was a contemporary, Eugène Delacroix, who was considered to be an academic, but really did focus on a kind of more modern view of color and compositions. And we have liberty leading the people. So the Great French Revolution, and then a detail of that work, which you'd never know unless you stood in front of it and copied it. Yes, it's a lobster and a hare. A lobster here, and then a hare. A rabbit?
If I didn't know, I would say the face is the ear of the rabbit, and in front of it kind of looks like eyes.
Another 19th century work, Jean-Léon Gérôme, again, who did the lithographs that brought the academic world to the academic art world to America. Another academic, Bouguereau, he was really popular in America. Very twee works, very saccharine, very sweet. Just had a show of his at the Brooks a couple of months back. Very beautiful works on the surface, but very much about, pleasure. Not sure why I have that in there. Typically, wooden tablets would have been used before paper. It was very expensive. Paper, as you know, good paper is made out of cotton. So around 1500 or so, people actually started to work on paper, which is why we have evidence of those drawings. The cartoon as a concept actually comes from the transfer of drawings for the plotting of a painting. And so the master would have done a very, very large drawing, or the size of its canvas or panel. He would have drawn it, and then the assistants would have made tiny little holes on all of the lines, little tiny pinholes. Then that piece of paper would have been put over the panel, canvas, or wall, and then it would have been tamped over with essentially a sock filled with charcoal, transferring the drawing through those little holes. So cartoon is actually that. It's the drawing meant to transfer a painting down to scale. So we got a little copy of Water, essentially, a study of water done by Leonardo. A study done by Raphael, and you see how he's doing the thumbnails here. And he's working out the thumbnail of the Madonna and Child and St. John the Baptist here. That's what we're looking at. So the thumbnail, you see he's changed it, changed positions, changed even the direction, really done an in-depth study of the body and the architecture of the gown or cloth. And then we see the final painting. So you see the entire thought process here gets planned out through drawing. Metalpoint is something you might not be familiar with. If you gesso paper and you take any kind of metal, like the back of an earring or a long wire that you put into a stylus, essentially a mechanical pencil, and you draw over that gessoed paper, there will be a chemical reaction that will leave behind lines. And over the course of time, those lines will essentially change. They will rust, or they will sort of create a kind of patina, like bronze does, over age, creating a very, very beautiful, desirable surface. And that is called metal point. You can do it with gold, you can do it with silver, you can do it with copper, you can do it with a coin if you wanted to. It can't be erased, though. It has to be sanded down and regessoed. So you've got to be really confident. And then, of course, tooth. We know what tooth is, which is the surface of the paper. Fixative is used to adhere the drawing media to the paper. Way back when, we used to use a glue. It could have been like horsehide glue, where the horse's skin would have been dried and then ground up, and then boiling water would have put in, and you would have had glue. Or milk. Milk is a protein, and so you would put it in a what's called a I can't remember what it's called now. Poop. You blow into it, and it essentially creates a kind of spray. And milk would have been used to fix charcoal to drawings. And so we've got some later drawings here. Conte was invented much later in the 19th century. It's got wax into essentially just, charcoal powder. And it's pressed into a form. It's pressed into a perfect form, which would have allowed you to graze over the surface of a tooth. And so what you're seeing is a Seurat drawing, and he invented he's most well known for pointillism. He's using this sort of pointillist technique using the surface of the paper. A modern contemporary master via Selman's drawing of water, drawing using erasure. Pastel is simply pigment with a hide glue, so like rabbit skin glue, usually, pressed into forms. Then we have palimpsest. That's a word I use a lot. That is the ghost image left behind when there's a change. This is a Degas drawing. So for collectors, that's actually very desirable, seeing the master's thought process through evidence of physical change in the structure of the drawing. So you see this sort of ghost images of the legs moving. And that is a preparatory drawing for his dancer, his tiny dancer. That is very, very well-known sculpture. More Degas. We got an example of some oil sticks. And oil sticks are essentially just dried oil paint pressed into forms. So oil pastel is that. Sometimes there's a little wax in them. It depends on the quality. And then pen and ink, and brush and ink, of course. Ink would have been taken from cuttlefish, which is a type of squid. It could also be made from gall nuts, which are little nuts that fall from oak trees. And you can basically just suspend it in a medium or like an alcohol and suck brown liquid from it. Can also be made from actual pigments. So here we have sepia. So sepia is like a stone earth ground up. You can use that as an ink as well. Some more master copies, some Rubens. Look at that back. Yes. Another Rubens that is actually a copy of a Michelangelo painting that is now destroyed. A Leonardo da Vinci. So the painting of this drawing is gone. We no longer have it, and we still have the evidence of the drawing itself. So you see, sometimes buildings burn down and artwork is just destroyed forever. And that's happened quite a bit. People stealing it, loot, right? Loot during war. They might destroy it in order to hide the evidence. Raphael, really beautiful chalk drawing here, done with like a terra, like a clay. There we have an amazing drapery study executed in charcoal, chalk. More Michelangelo. Pontormo. More Pontormo. And this is a very famous painting. And then, of course, we are going to end on Michelangelo and his study of the body. And, of course, you've all heard the stories of him in the middle of the night opening up bodies because it was illegal. The Catholic Church did not allow for the body to be defiled after death. And they gave him a special arrangement that allowed him to essentially work on the cadavers of criminals that had been executed. And so he spent a couple of years, I think, really doing a deep dive into the anatomy of figures, every single aspect of anatomy. And some of them are incredibly accurate. Some of them are wildly off. I've got another Proudhon drawing, and then we end on Ang. So essentially what your assignment is going to be is to copy any masterwork pre-19th century. So you're going to go to the library, you're going to go on Google, and you're going to find a reputable artist that is known to the canon of art history, and you are going to do a faithful master study of that. Does it have to be, if, this one is only charcoal pencil on paper, does it have to be the exact size? No. Could you do this heightened on gray paper with some white and add some sort of, additional volume to it? Yes, you can. So your job is to do a deep dive, as close a facsimile as you can, but not completely faithful in terms of media, of a masterwork pre-19th century. So it's got to be before 1900. Okay? Questions about that? And that'll be next week. I'll ask that you print off your copy in good quality paper, so pay that $1 at Walmart if you need to in order to get that print, or print it off in color if it is in color, but you're going to need to be prepared to do that starting on Monday. Questions?
Does the masterwork does our version of the masterwork need to be in color, or
No.
just charcoal?
We start color after that.
Okay.
All right. So